Hi there. Earlier today, I had the pleasure of speaking with Ben Lake, who's the MP for Ceredigion on behalf of Plaid Cymru. It was a fantastic conversation. We touched on all manner of topics. We discussed Brexit and the future of politics in the UK. We spoke about how Plaid Cymru can appeal more to communities across Wales. And if you have any interest in politics in general, Wales specifically, you're going to find this a really interesting conversation. So please enjoy. All right. So I have with me, I'm very fortunate to have with me today, Ben Lake, who is still 3 years after he got to Westminster, one of the youngest MPs there, which is amazing stuff. Good to see you today, Ben.
It's nice to see you, David.
And we were just going to discuss a few aspects about Ben's politics, why Ben got involved in the first instance in this field, and then talk about some of the key issues that we have at this point in time. There's lots of stuff that's dominating the short-term agenda, if you like, whether it's COVID, whether it's Brexit. There's no shortage of sort of bad news stories to go after. So we'll talk about those, but also we'll talk about some of the more long-term aspirations that Ben has about politics and where he'd like to see the impact that he has go. So, I mean, the first place to start has got to be with your own reflections on your experiences. You've had an amazing time, obviously, for the last 3 years, doing a role that is incredibly important, very high publicity, lots of people depending on you. What are your sort of key reflections of what you've learned in the past 3 years in your role?
That's a great question, because it has been I know it's cliche, but it has been a real learning curve, becoming an MP and being an MP during not just all the uncertainty of Brexit, but also for the pandemic. Mm-hmm. I think the biggest lesson that I've learned, and something that I didn't expect to experience, is the variety of characters and personalities that every constituency has. You think you know your area well, then you're elected to represent that area, and you realise that you don't know it at all. There are characters, there are groups, there are communities that so varied, not just in terms of what they do or who they are, but the sort of representation they expect and they want from you. Some will be very happy not to communicate or receive any communication from you, as long as you do the right thing in Parliament. Others would prefer to have more regular unsolicited updates, almost. Others then still will prefer far more detailed kind of discussions on both matters of policy and conscience that perhaps it's a little bit surprising. Certainly I was surprised just how many people enjoy that sort of conversation and relationship with an MP. It's not just signing a petition and then expecting them to raise it in Parliament. It's actually, let's explore why you hold these views or why I hold particular views, and see where we can go with it. So that was quite an interesting lesson. Another lesson then is more of a practical one, I suppose. The role of the MP is different than perhaps the way it's envisaged in the kind of public conscience. I think I entered the MP perhaps naively, thinking that the most important element or aspect of the work was your work in Parliament. And by that I mean lobbying government ministers, organisations, what have you, raising questions, debates, scrutinising legislation, that sort of parliamentary work of an MP. And it is a very important aspect of the work, but actually your time as an MP is dominated really by helping people with individual casework that is not necessarily parliamentary, although sometimes you will have need to raise a piece of casework with ministers or indeed in the House of Commons. Mm-hmm. So it's becoming quite adept and knowledgeable about the benefit system, about a whole manner of things, whether it's mortgages to prescriptions. You need to know which energy companies have certain types of complaint and appeal systems. It's really quite a detailed knowledge that you have to kind of accrue quite quickly on a range of stuff. Luckily, of course, and every MP is the same in having a team of staff to help with a lot of the practical day-to-day work. Otherwise, you won't be able to do it. But I think it was an interesting lesson that most of your time as MP is spent on the specifics and practical issues, and not so much the broader, big political questions. And the last 3 years, I believe, I understand from speaking to MPs who've been MPs for quite some time, some of them a few decades, the last few years have been unique in that the pressure on both aspects of the role, if you like, has been quite incredible. You have had, during the pandemic especially, but before that as well, an increasing number of individuals turning to MPs' offices for help with quite serious and pressing problems. And then also the great matters of state, and to put the grand title, some of the debates on Brexit, but also now the pandemic, are equally important and pressing, and you can't really ignore or in any way neglect that side of the duties. So it's taught me a lot about the nature of our democracy. And actually, I think one of my conclusions in terms of governance and the health of our democracy is perhaps it's more of a question now that I think about it. How sustainable is it? Because you either have representatives who do just that. They represent the views of their constituents. They can try to convey and feed those views into debates on both government policy and legislation. Or you have offices that are run solely for the purposes of troubleshooting and helping people. I think you need both, but my question is how, given the current level of demand on both sides of that job, how sustainable is it for individual MPs? And I'll share something with you. There was a point in time at the height of the pandemic where the level of correspondence I was receiving, both written and digital, was incredible. I was receiving, for a good few weeks, during the hours of, say, 9 a.m. and 9 p.m., I was receiving several emails a minute, and each of it very pressing, very relevant. Individuals worried about a loved one's health, or some worried about their businesses, some others then worried about their jobs, and all very relevant. And it was right that they were turning to me for assistance and advice. But for those 2 weeks, you could have asked me as an MP what was being discussed in Parliament, and I'd have a very poor grip on the issue. Not because I wasn't trying, it was just my whole time had to be dedicated to helping those, attend to those pressing issues. Right. And one might argue, well, it was exceptional. It's a pandemic, that'll be that. And I hope so. But if we do have the current situation where, yes, we're still in the pandemic, but by and large, the situation has been brought into some sort of control. It's still quite a task to keep on top of both your inbox and the parliamentary agenda. And having spoken to other MPs who've been in Westminster for decades, as I say, Ken Clarke, he says this in his memoirs, or he alludes to it, that when he first went to Parliament as MP, it was very rare for a constituent to be directly raising a concern or piece of casework as we now understand it. It was far more in terms of legislation or matters of state. By the time he retired, he makes the point in his memoirs that the role that he has performed has completely changed. And it's unrecognisable to that of, I think he went in the 70s, when most MPs, of course, also had another job during the day. The thought that you could do that now is just absolutely ludicrous. You just couldn't do justice to anything.
Yep.
But so that's been a learning curve. And the final thing then, a lesson that is probably applicable to all walks of life, but is knowing when to say no. Particularly as a politician, the tendency to say yes and to agree to everything and to agree to help everybody is very tempting, and one that it's a difficult lesson to learn, but it's a lesson that you need to learn quickly if you're to survive, because sadly you can't be everywhere, and you can't promise everybody that you'll be able to fix their problem. Sometimes you just have to politely disagree and say, sorry, I can't, or you have to make it very clear and manage their expectations that you'll do your very best, but you can't guarantee that there'll be an outcome that pleases them. Mm-hmm. So I think those three are the biggest lessons I've learned in the 3 years since being elected.
Well, it's a nice. What's nice about that, I think, is that you the best one to me is that you came into the job expecting there to be a lot of, I guess, the more grand role of it. You know, you're part of a community of 650 people who made the laws for 65 million people, right? So you would think it's very macroscopic and you're focusing on laws and bills and factions and so on, but actually that it's a very concrete role. That's really interesting to hear. And also that I think, you know, you could have watched the news for the last 5 years, probably since the independence referendum in Scotland. There's just been a lot going on in sort of the high end of politics, but it's interesting to hear that actually that gets reflected, of course, in everyday people's lives, because Brexit, whether it's COVID, whether it's all the big political moves that are happening, it's not just about big legislative changes and flux in that area, but that has knock-on consequences for people in their life and their ability to get by. So it's really interesting to hear that kind of is reflected, and that's something that you've taken stock of as interesting. So just to speak a bit more to the current situation, as we say, sort of a historic time for the UK as a whole, a lot of change is happening. And what's your take on how both Brexit and the pandemic and everything else, where we will land on this in a few years' time? Because I think a lot of people really feel a lot of uncertainty and a lot of worry because everything seems to be changing and it's just not clear how it will pan out. So how do you think things might end up?
Yeah, I agree. I think uncertainty is the word, without a doubt. I believe in the last few years, probably, well, blimey, it may well have been, might predate the 2016 referendum, but certainly since 2016, there has been a real re-engagement with politics or political issues in the population, and I think that's a good thing. First of all, you know, in abject terms, that is a good thing. You want people to have an opinion, you know, whichever, even if that means that it makes for quite difficult discussions and quite testing kind of meetings for the MPs. You want that for democracy, that people do take a view and are very happy to convey those views and with the relevant people, MPs or councillors or whatever. But what I think it's really done this time around is it's been coupled with the maturing, for want of a better word, of social media platforms. Mm-hmm. And this may be controversial to say, actually, but it's people having strong views isn't necessarily a new thing. I accept that. You will have had individuals who are outspoken since the dawn of time, for all I know. Mm-hmm. But what social media has been able to do is to give them a platform that hitherto would have been unimaginable. You know, you imagine maybe they would have had a bit of an audience in a pub, local, if they had an inclination to stand for elected office at whatever level, then yes, they may have, you know, been able to give speeches, to share their opinions to a wider audience. But by and large, it's, you know, a local select group of people, friends, family, or neighbours, and that would have in itself then, maybe emboldened them in their views and thought that they were right. But social media means that not only are they able to contact and communicate to a far bigger audience from a global audience, but the way in which a lot of these algorithms work is that it filters them into whether it's feeds, threads, what have you, of like-minded people, the echo chamber. And again, somebody challenged me a few months ago when I made a similar point that echo chambers aren't necessarily new. And again, I concede it's not a new phenomenon. You would have, whereas perhaps now it's on Twitter or Facebook, in the past, you would have been able to join a club or a society, and again, there might have been groupthink. I mean, yeah, of course there would have been. What social media has meant is that you can now, emboldened by 30 likes or what have you, communicate from your sofa to elected officials, celebrities, you name it, without any filter, and convey things over in quite a strong way. Now, again, somebody might argue, well, it's not impossible pre-social media, the social media age. No, again, no. But as I mentioned, pre-social media, if you really wanted to get into that situation, you would probably have had to stand for a local committee, for a group or an organisation. There's a check there. There's a filter. You will have come up against somebody who maybe doesn't actually agree with you 100%. And your views might be softened or modified. Then once on that committee, to be the regional representative or what have you, again, there's another process of just challenging the view, improving the opinion perhaps, not necessarily changing it, but softening it, targeting it in a better way, what have you. Whereas now there is no control, there is no checks. So you can get to the level of what was perhaps in the pre-social media age, a rant in the pub, to communicating with an elected official or anybody for that matter in authority, or without any sort of check, and perhaps the challenge or the probingness of, am I completely right here? Because all you've had is 30 or 100 people agreeing with you. So you think, yeah. And what that has meant is you've got people are far more certain of their views. And when they come up against challenge at that late stage then, as opposed to accepting it and perhaps absorbing it, contemplating, okay, considering maybe they've got a point. It's like, well, no, I know I'm right. They're off their heads. And all of a sudden it makes for a far more fractious debate. And from a fractious debate, you get, more often than not, just pure hatred.
Right.
And that's just an analogy, I suppose, or a hypothetical example. But I do think we see that across the country and the population. And in the last few years, we perhaps have been unfortunate in that both Brexit, no, not both, just Brexit in particular, has been such a divisive issue.
Yeah.
And, I can't think of anything else that's been quite as divisive. And so it's been, I think Brexit would have been quite a difficult issue for many families and communities anyway. You throw social media into it, and it's just, the pub disagreement on steroids. And we've had that argument now across the UK. It's tempting to think that it's now died down, but there's still embers, that refuse to die. That you now and again, you still get somebody just mentioned in Parliament, oh, you're a Remainer, that's why you're saying it.
Right.
So it still hasn't quite gone away. And the consequence is that you've polarised the population into two camps. Those who have an interest, those who have been agitated by the European question, they've been polarised into two camps. And people talk about culture wars and what have you. That's one of the big things that needs to happen to begin with, is that you do have an us and them. And before 2016, let's think back to maybe 2010 and the first decade of the 21st century. There were a lot of complaints and articles written about how little difference there was between the major parties and their policy positions, and that there was almost a consensus had been reached. The end of history and all this.
Francis Fukuyama,
all this kind of, and then that wishful thinking came crashing down, back down to earth in a very ugly manner. So that's a very long-winded way of saying as we now approach the difficult questions of reality that the withdrawal of the UK from the European Union will present come 1st of December, as opposed to, I fear, identifying correctly that these are issues that should have been sorted out during negotiations, and there were political reasons why they weren't. Irrational reasons as well, I'd argue, or motives rather. Because the way in which population has been polarised, as opposed to having a sensible conversations why things went wrong and how to fix it, it'll just be, oh, those fifth columnists over there, they're Remainers, they've frustrated everything.
Right.
Blimey, I saw the other day on Twitter, I think, a bit of traction on this suggestion that Joe Biden's going to torpedo Brexit talks, as if, because he's a Remainer. I'm like thinking, my God. So I don't think the next few years are going to be much better, to be honest with you. I think there's a lot more strife to come politically. I think that the big question will be, where will this anti-politic sentiment go next? Or in other words, where will it be, or at who will it be directed at next? Because the European Union's gone. As I say, there might be a few lingering complaints, but it's no longer a target. They've dealt with that. They've achieved what they wanted to achieve. Where does the next target come from? And I needn't tell you, because I know you've got an interest in history as well, but that sort of phenomenon and sentiment can lead us down to very ugly paths. And so I think there's going to be quite a bit more uncertainty as we come out of this pandemic, when we come out of it, or we will come out of it, but the economic impact of it, the longer-term economic scarring, it's not going to be fair, it's not going to be equal. There will be winners, there will be losers from it. And that will introduce another level of tension. Will it be that people in the public sector, workers who work in the public sector, are going to be the next target? Because most of them haven't been furloughed. They haven't had that sort of economic hit as those in the private sector have had to suffer. Dominic Cummings' departure, or apparent departure from 10 Downing Street, might mean it won't be against the civil service and the public sector, and then another target will be found. Will it be devolved administrations? That's quite a plausible one, in my opinion. It's an easy way of apportioning blame, and especially if the devolved administrations are unable or unwilling to challenge some of those accusations. But anybody hoping for a period of calm in UK politics, I think will be left disappointed, or at least for a few years yet.
Yeah, I mean, just a phenomenally insightful take. I think a lot of, probably the majority of people are sick and tired of whether it's Brexit, all this division. I think at root, people just want to get along, and they want to have communities that are a bit more harmonious, in some ways that they used to be, as you say, in the pre-digital age. But I think the kind of what we need to hear rather than what we want to hear is that these issues haven't been played out. And as you said, a lot of what drove Brexit in the first instance, and the polarization that drove that entire and characterized the referendum campaign, has just continued in the post-Brexit era. The notion of people coming together and some kind of healing and some kind of compromise being struck just hasn't taken place. And so I think it's a really insightful take, and good for everybody listening to take that home with them, that there's a lot more difficulty to overcome and a lot more work to do and a lot more challenges that we will face. I want to move on to talk about something very different, or we briefly touched on it, which is Wales and the economic situation in Wales. And try and have a bit more, I guess, like a positive segment here, because we've been a little bit kind of dark so far, a bit gloomy. I think it's nice to talk about, looking further into the future, and also kind of things that we can do constructively to make things better. And this obviously is a critical question for people in Wales. It has implications for their pay packets, has implications for the health and prosperity of the communities they live in. It's very, very important for our young people and the opportunities that they have. And it's also for the perspective of someone who is part of Plaid Cymru, it's arguably an essential part of the case for whether it's further devolution, whether it's independence, there's always that nagging question that gets asked: how can Wales feasibly do this with the economic base that is in place? So one thing I want to focus on is, you've had some very interesting points before about the need for Wales to move on from a core the UK to move on from a core periphery model of its economics, and in particular for more rural parts of Wales and for the country as a whole to have more of a priority being given to them within politics. Do you want to speak more to that?
Yeah, well, thank you, David. Yes, because it would have been, if it wasn't for Brexit and COVID, I think it would have been the key debate of this Parliament. Sorry, and when I mean the rural areas versus the urban areas, also, I suppose, I'm probably echoing a little bit of the Johnson administration's aspiration of levelling up the nations and the regions. A lot of what I think they're trying to address applies to the rural urban debate just as much as it does, London versus the rest of the UK. So what I mean by it, in a nutshell, is that we have in the UK, and it's been centuries, right, in the making, a system whereby the London and the southeast of England, by and large, has been the centre of economic wealth and commerce for certainly the last half a century. Obviously, during the Industrial Revolution, the Midlands and parts of north of England were just as important, and South Wales and the Docklands and what have you. But since the Industrial Revolution, and then I'd say post Second World War, we've seen a constant process whereby the relative power in economic terms, and therefore also political terms, within the UK has been balanced towards London and the southeast of England. Raymond Williams argues it far better than I do, and there's a really good clip that I encourage you to look at, where he's talking about Cambridge when he was there, and he makes this kind of observation. Maybe it's partly geography and geology, and waterways of the Thames, the main arteries in medieval times and what have you, and the bread baskets, ample food and resources allows then all the development, and that's I think is a very interesting thesis. But certainly now in the modern world, whereby we are not so dependent on our ability to conduct economic activity. We're not as dependent on having to locate it where there's an abundance of food growing. We have these things called cars and lorries that are great in delivering these essential foodstuffs from one part of the country where they have an abundance of them to others. And so the argument that the southeast, where the population has now accumulated, needs to remain as the centre for most economic development and investment, I think is out of date, and it's not a product of any malice. Some people might argue that it is. It's not. I'm very clear this is not any malice. It's just, as humans, and particularly when you work in politics, sometimes it's easier just to keep things as they are than it is to change them, especially when it's on the matter of changing a system whereby some will lose out from it, relatively speaking. And an example of the Westminster system being hesitant to change things that have been identified by themselves as being ineffective is the Barnett formula. When Barnett introduced the formula, it was perhaps not at the time, but since then it's been famously remarked, that it was only to be a temporary measure, and yet we are nearly 50 years down the line, approaching 50 years down the line. It's still the most important factor of deciding how much money the devolved governments have to spend on key services, from education and health to the environment, everything. So my contention, I suppose, is not too dissimilar to Raymond Williams's thesis that economic wealth equals political power, and when you map that over the geography of the land, economics are often pull factors, drawing more population into certain areas and cities, and so naturally they will have more representation in our parliaments. That will then ensure that any policies are better suited to those very same urban areas. And this is all, again, I'm not saying there's any malice in it. It's just kind of the laws of gravity of politics, really. The reason why I think it needs to be changed is not only that a lot of those individuals who live in rural areas lose out, and I don't just mean like those who live in hamlets, but also mean some market towns that are reasonable sizes, which have reasonable population centres, but because they're not just quite as big as cities nearby, they don't get the same sort of attention. They don't carry the same sort of political weight, and so their needs and aspirations are always going to be secondary. And one of the ways in which you can start changing that is looking at the public sector, both in terms of government investment, whether that is infrastructure. So, for example, it's certainly not my idea. I copied it from somebody else. Went for some large infrastructure projects that you approach an outside-in approach. So I think it may well have been HS2. They argued, well, you start building it in the north and then work your way down to London. A more relevant issue for certainly for West Wales and in Ceredigion in particular is broadband and superfast and fibre broadband, I beg your pardon. And there's been an argument of, well, in terms of state investment in digital infrastructure, it's far better to target and focus state or public money in those areas where the commercial private market just will not serve. Unfortunately, that wasn't the way in which we approached it when we started doing it properly about 10, 15 years ago. By now, credit where credit's due, governments have realised the value of such an approach, and you are seeing more targeted interventions now that for full fibre service in particular, it's the rural areas or the areas that are not commercially viable for rollout that get the investment. But that's just an ad hoc thing. For more of a systematic approach, you need to make sure that key elements of the civil service of the state are actually decentralised. Now, again, it's something that the Cullen-Johnson administration appears to be exploring. The reports of moving, for example, the Treasury and some key ministries out of London. The Welsh government, when Plaid Cymru was in government 2007 to 2011 with the Labour Party, they introduced a decentralisation strategy, which saw vast, quite big, modern Welsh government buildings being constructed in Caernarfon, in Aberystwyth, Carmarthen, with the idea of getting a lot of these jobs out of Cardiff. And it's important because in many of, in areas such as Ceredigion, a Welsh government job is very well paid in terms of local wages and salaries. It offers that choice to young people. And yes, on the edges, you might only be talking about a couple of dozen jobs here and there, but they're good, well-paid jobs. And as we know, people tend to spend their money in the local area, even in the age of the internet. They still spend a lot in the local areas, particularly in terms of services and pubs, restaurants, what have you, which in turn offers an opportunity, and there's a lot that can be done in terms of economic development and rebalancing that doesn't require, building motorways everywhere or high-speed rails everywhere. You get me fibre broadband to every house in Ceredigion, especially after the experience of the pandemic, I should add. And I can almost guarantee you that a lot of the big companies in the private sector will be looking to locate themselves here, or even allowing their employees to work from Ceredigion, work remotely, because we've got everything else.
Right.
And it's just that element of having the career choice and the work that we need. And that applies to most rural areas. I could talk a lot longer about this, but I know it's of an interest to me, but it may not be for everybody. So I'll just finish with the point that There's a very striking set of maps that look at I believe it's the average travel time, or commuting time, sorry, of various European countries. And from that, you can kind of gather or identify the main economic centres. So Germany, for example, have several. You've got several, yes, Berlin, but you've got Frankfurt, you've got Hamburg, you've got all the cities. It's quite a regional situation in Germany with the different Länder. They clearly have their own economic centres. There's something, but not quite as pronounced in France. But then you come to the UK, and it's clear that the main game is in London, and you have people from Ceredigion commuting to London, and I think for too long, and certainly in the last few years, there's been too much emphasis when it comes to infrastructure of how can we better connect the periphery to London so that they can get to London easier, as opposed to thinking, hang on, would it be better and cheaper for us to not have a situation where they have to go to London? And I suppose that's the dilemma, or the problem that I've identified, and I think can be addressed by rebalancing, to put a nice spin on it, rebalance the political and economic situation in the UK.
Well, speaking as a 22-year-old Welsh kid who grew up in a farming village where the Wi-Fi kept going down, and having moved to London where, along with everything else, the internet is great, everything's on your doorstep, I certainly feel that, and that resonates with me, what you said about the sort of big economic migration that has been the case for so long in the UK. And certainly, I don't know whether it's at 2 a.m. when there's cars going past beeping in London, that I wonder if there's a different way of setting things up for an economy, especially since so many of us, myself included, working from home in any case with this pandemic. I just want to sort of share a couple of reflections on what you said. The first about whether this needs to be reframed as an issue, right? Because I think for a long time, the powers that be in the UK have viewed London as this big engine that has to drag along a bunch of albatrosses around the neck, which are the regions, which are the rural parts, which are kind of left behind. And there's just, there are debates around the sort of narrow debate around how much to give those regions, how much extra subsidy to provide, but there's never been a bigger conversation around why do we permit a situation where we view everywhere apart from London as a liability or as something that holds us back. So that, I think, is a really important conversation that needs to shift, is especially with digital changes, that we can view, parts of the world like Ceredigion. There's no reason why people there can't have thriving jobs, why they can't be part of a very dynamic economic community. It's just a matter of will and a matter of making it happen in the first instance. And I think that's a really important idea for Wales, especially, which does have a big rural population, obviously, and where sort of Cardiff has tended to be the end of the line for a lot of the stuff that has been invested in. And I think the second reflection is around the point you said about the state making a contribution and making a difference where the sort of laws of free market economics suggest that nothing is going to happen otherwise. I think that's really critical. If we go back to even how the internet was developed in the first instance, I mean, the internet was born out of work done by US military organizations in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that involved billions of dollars being spent. Private sector had no interest. Businesses were generally just not interested in the internet as a possibility. And here we are 40 years later, because of that groundwork, the entire world economy is being driven through the internet, and it's changing everything. So I think that's really a big lesson in the role that the government can play, and that it hasn't got to be seen as something to minimize, but it can have an active role in helping economic development. I want to move on, though. I think there is also a case to say that in Wales, it's not just about more state involvement and more investment from the government, but also more of what the civic society and private society can do to produce a more dynamic economy. And part of that is around a culture of entrepreneurship and risk-taking, which we typically don't associate with Wales. I think we would probably both agree that Wales is a place which is pretty cautious. People like how things are and like things the way they are. and that's something that we all respect and we feel as well. But just in terms of the nature of modern economies, that we need to some extent to look at that. What's your kind of view about how that can be promoted in Wales?
Yeah, I think you're right. There is certainly the perception that, for whatever reason, the kind of element of risk-taking perhaps isn't as apparent in Wales in terms of the economy as other parts of the UK. It's interesting, though, that in terms of the number of startups, we do seem to do very well. And I'm not quite sure what the reasons are behind that. But we certainly don't see then that development from the initial startup, which we have many of them, and we compare very favourably with other parts of the UK, to then, the more developed businesses and up to the multinationals and the
Right.
big companies.
We're still waiting for our first Welsh unicorn.
Yeah, exactly. There's something there that you have plenty of entrepreneurs giving it a go in Wales, and it'd be interesting to know whether are they primarily linked to universities and further education institutions, perhaps. I'm not sure, actually, but we certainly don't have that. I'm trying to think of the word. It's not quite development. It's I've left. I'm thinking in Welsh at the moment, so I'm trying to translate at the same time. But in terms of how to really bring about a change of gear to the private sector and civic society in general in Wales, there's, again, in my opinion, a need to fix the public pound or the public sector's pound on investment in Wales to begin with. And as a Remainer, that's one opportunity, if you like, that I am willing to concede that leaving the European Union may give. It'll give far more flexibility in terms of procurement law. And I think there's a lot to be said about in these areas where the commercial habitat has been decimated over years, decades, what have you, of inactivity, or relative inactivity, beg your pardon, that there does need to be an injection of public procurement, an injection of cash that public procurement can give to really kind of spark that interest. And it may well be the case that you have existing small or the startup companies, so they're able to get a big customer in the public sector. It allows them then that base to grow, that solid base for 2, 3, however long the public contract is, on which then to plan other initiatives, other aspects of their business. And it's more relevant probably in your Ceredigions than your Cardiffs, right? Because population offers its own opportunity in Cardiff. Concentration of, what is Cardiff? 200,000 people, 300,000 people. It's and the wider Valleys area. You're talking a significant chunk of the Welsh population there. They'll have that to feed on. But in the more the rest of Wales, the public sector will have a key role to play in just sparking that interest from the private sector. There are other things, though, that I think hinder the development of the private sector in Wales. And again, we're coming back to just basic infrastructure. I remember having a conversation with a business that still located in Ceredigion and often supply goods, to London and Bristol mainly. But they've located in Ceredigion because they're from Ceredigion and want to stay in Ceredigion and support the local economy. But they pointed out that decision was commercially a bad one. And so then the question arises, well, why specifically is it a bad commercial decision? And the sector that they were in the food sector, and they're talking about servicing and supplying the hospitality and service sectors, and it's basically distance from market. So it was far better for them commercially to locate themselves in the M4 corridor. That would be the commercially sane idea. Why? Well, it was because that the roads, the time it took to travel from Ceredigion to their main markets over the A roads that are often not really A roads.
B minus.
Yeah, exactly. They'd be, what we think of a main road would be looked down upon in some parts of the UK as a dirt track. Maybe not quite dirt track, but certainly not an A road. And it'd be far better for them to locate themselves on the M4 corridor. It would save a lot in terms of, yes, transport and mileage, but more importantly, time. So when you're presented with that specific example, if the road network was better and more efficient, or, dare I say it, we had better rail freight capacity in Wales, all of a sudden those businesses don't have to take a commercial hit to stay in some areas of Wales. They can still operate, develop their product and their goods and supply markets, in London or in Bristol, and not be at a competitive disadvantage not at a disadvantage with their competitors. Then you have that's more of a practical, having a good and having to take it somewhere. But then you've got a similar problem when it comes to some of the research and scientific businesses. Not many people know, but Ceredigion has quite an interesting and thriving science park in Aberystwyth, linked with, the university, IBRAS as well, and the Centre for Innovation. But also down in Ffostrasol, and I'd be very surprised if any of the listeners will know where Ffostrasol is or ever heard of Ffostrasol. There's quite an impressive facility there that produces snake venom and exports it, across the world. Clearly, there isn't a domestic market really for snake venom. Well, maybe
my
for
favorite. My favorite. I am all the demand.
Yeah, so it's possible, but these are the exceptions, and they have to take a hit, and are willing to take that hit. And for them, in the science park, for example, the services that they can give, there's a very good company with Environment Systems, and they do a lot of climate and environment modelling using satellite data and what have you, and they can work for anybody in the world. They can do it from Aberystwyth, but internet is key. Good internet connection, and the way in which the world is going, you need gigabit connection, really. You need your full fibre as a minimum. Otherwise, you may well be able to hobble along for a year or two, but in the not too distant future, it's going to be insufficient, and then you'll be facing the equivalent of the dirt track road versus the motorway. So in vast tracts of Wales, that those issues of infrastructure, it's basics really. It's not a terribly complicated problem. It just requires, and as you put it, it requires that will to put right. And we're looking now at internet, and maybe I'm guilty here of placing too much stock in. You get everybody connected to full fibre, and Wales will be a hotbed of economic activity. It'll be, maybe I'm guilty of it.
The four of Europe.
Yeah, exactly. I may well be. I might be guilty. I'm willing to concede. I may be guilty of a little bit of naivety in that sense. But it is striking to me the number of businesses that you talk to in places like Ceredigion that produce goods or offer a service that are in demand across the world. The reason they stay here is often one of loyalty and desire to give it a go and to prove almost gravity wrong, and that they can make a success of it. And all too often, if they were able to get their goods to the market a little bit quicker, and we're not talking now, shortening the distance between Bristol and Ceredigion. What we're talking about is that you don't have to spend the first hour and a half of your journey on roads that are very, very generously classified as A or B roads. Or it's also that you don't have to depend, when you're talking with businesses such as Pepsi Cola, offering them a digital satellite imaging service or what have you to monitor their crops. You're not depending on super fast broadband that is termed super fast, but on a wet and windy day can often be less than. You know, it's that sort of issue that can be addressed, would then mean that those contracts or potential work with PepsiCo or whoever do come their way. They are then able to employ an extra 3 or 4 people for that contract. They are then, you know, it's almost, as soon as you decide that rural areas or areas that are not the main cities are potential economic engines in and of themselves, you quickly identify the problems. You quickly can say, well, this is what we need to do, blah, 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 blah. The biggest challenge is to change mindsets, that as opposed to having the Northern Powerhouse economic Midlands engines or whatever it's called now, and London, that it's actually something that can be far more dispersed and as relevant for your Strassols as it is your Frankfurts, you know? And you make that change of attitude and thinking. All the other things, it's just a matter of political will. You know, we're spending, for example, you know, we are spending on rail infrastructure in this country. We are spending on road infrastructure in this country. We're spending on upgrading the digital infrastructure in this country. The question is, where are we spending it?
Right, exactly.
And you know, I think it's a ridiculous situation. And this will be my final point at this point, because I can feel myself ranting. A ridiculous situation where you have areas of the country that are now being rolled out with 5G mobile network coverage, when I still have vast tracts and communities in my patch that don't have any signal at all. I'm not saying tops of mountains and, you know, isolate in inhabited areas. Okay, fine, that's one of those things. No, I'm talking about villages and communities. And it's, you know, if they had 4G and go up to 4G, 3G and go up to 5G, well, okay, fine. But 5G versus nothing, that's a failure of public policy.
Yeah. No, again, very, very interesting to hear. And I think the theme that seems to be developing is sort of, it's the Wi-Fi stupid, seems to be a big theme. And I think that does make sense. I think it's quite exciting as an opportunity, actually, because the conventional logic, if you like, that we've worked against is you need to build so much infrastructure that it's not worth it in these parts of the country. But really, for lots of digital type businesses, it's just one issue that needs to really be focused down, and as you say, a matter of political will. And that's very notable. And giving these businesses, we're seeing entrepreneurial culture developing in all parts of Wales. We're just not empowering those individuals. We're not accelerating the work they can do. We're not providing a platform that lets them thrive and succeed. And I think something definitely to consider is how we can help to digitize these parts of Wales, because again, there seems to be some kind of existing zeitgeist that it's the big cities that are digital and everywhere else is just stuck in the past and we've got to subsidize them. But actually, that's not the case if you speak to people in those areas. And I think that's a real priority to work on in the coming years, alongside Brexit and not drowning in all those issues, obviously. I want to touch on one more point and one more question around ultimately what Plaid Cymru was founded to do and to achieve, and its mission, which is to achieve independence in Wales. What we've seen recently is actually quite stark in that whereas in 2014, the support for independence was only 14%, it's now moved up to something like 32% in some recent polls in Wales. So there's a real big shift there. And based on the performance of government in recent years in the UK, you can probably understand why. Still a long way to go to kind of a toss-up situation where it really is a big national issue. What's your view in terms of what Plaid Cymru needs to do to move things forward? Because there is a charge that's been labelled at the party really ever since it was founded that it's just a party for rural people in Wales, or a party for Welsh speakers, or a party for West and Northern Wales, and that it's not really expanding out of those heartlands into cities, into the valleys, and having a big impression there politically. What do you think can be done about that?
That is the $1 million question. Because I agree with you that for, well, certainly its existence, so the best part of 100 years now, Plaid Cymru has always found greater support consistently in the areas that Northwest, West Wales, rural, but also just to add in some university towns as well. They've had a lot of success there, and that despite accepting certain chapters of real spikes in support in valleys areas and in South and Northeast Wales, by and large they are often the exception to the rule. Plaid Cymru is not always considered as that kind of viable choice, and it's a challenge that we've had to try and address now for, I'd argue, certainly since the dawn of devolution to Wales in 97, 99 and the election. But and it's a dilemma that's quite an interesting one, because not many people are aware that two measures, if you like, of political identity. And before I proceed, I know that it's a very difficult and sensitive topic to talk about, so I'm not meaning to offend in any way here now. But the census returns will often ask respondents to specify, their identity, and it's not perfect, and I'm not pretending it's perfect, but it's an interesting question that they've posed, and in years gone by they've asked, are you British, are you Welsh, British, and that sort of thing. Often people just look at the language question, whether they can speak Welsh, how much, so on, blah blah blah. And yeah, that is interesting to see, and you can map it in, and you can see clearly that where Plaid Cymru tends to do well in elections in all levels, it does correlate with areas of higher areas of Welsh speakers. But if you also then look at the question of identity, you do not find that same correlation of higher Welsh identity or Welsh-only identity and Plaid Cymru. There are some, so you look at the northwest of Wales, and yes, there's quite a significant Welsh-only identifying population, who vote Plaid Cymru. But if you want to look at the strongest areas of Wales who identify themselves as being Welsh only, you're looking at the valleys. In the 97, the devolution referendum, Carmarthenshire has this place in the history of devolution as the key, crucial county, and I'm not going to dispute that. I was born in Carmarthen, but we don't think of your Neaths, your Port who actually, I can't remember whether it was Neath or it was Port I think it was Port was the county in Wales, or the area in Wales, that voted strongest in terms of percentage for devolution. And they are often kind of written out as, well, they're never going to vote Plaid Cymru, And so, knowing that, you come quite quickly then to the Three in Wales model, which I think still holds a lot of explanatory power to the modern Wales, actually. But perhaps where I think the party needs to go is to, how do we appeal to those who identify themselves as being Welsh, are proudly Welsh, don't perhaps speak Welsh, that's a key thing, yes, but also, and this is a challenge sometimes, because particularly when you're in nationalist politics, there's a tendency to think that you have to have an enemy, right? It's an us and them thing again. And for the type of party Plaid Cymru, actually, that's not what we're about. We're not about that. We're civic nationalists, and as long as you care for Wales and want to be in Wales, then good enough for us. And somewhere along the line, we haven't quite managed to communicate that to people. They still think that you have to be born in Wales, speak Welsh to be Plaid Cymru. We've had now, well, if you want to be picky, I don't think Dafydd Wigley was born in Wales. But we've got, in Adam Price and Leanne Wood, two leaders who are not first language Welsh speakers. Adam and Leanne both have learned, yes, but the first languages are English. You've got Dafydd, who I'm pretty sure was born in England, although maybe I'm mistaken there. And yet we still haven't been able to convey that or smash that myth. So in order to do that, there's only one way of doing it. You have to go out to the communities and show yourselves. You be present, so that people realise that Plaid Cymru are not those people from, West Wales who live up in the caves and only speak Welsh, and they speak in rhyme and all this kind of stuff. And if you don't speak Welsh, they're going to hate you forever and all that nonsense. But there's no point doing it online anymore. Social media, it's too many echo chambers. You have to do it on social media. Yes, you can't not do it, because otherwise you lose the defensive game. But in order to win new people, or the offensive game, I think you just cannot be being out in the community. Show people through your actions, through your commitment to different causes locally, that you are there for them. And the problem or the challenge that presents itself then to Plaid Cymru is that we don't have that number, many members across Wales to be able to do that work. The people who win Plaid Cymru seats, such as Ceredigion, are those members in the 50s and the 60s who identify themselves as Plaid Cymru and went out to support common causes, local causes, who supported different charities locally, who did that work, who stood up, made arguments in favour of different issues locally. They then allowed people to stand for local council and what have you in the 60s and the 70s, and then start to really compete for the Westminster Parliament in the late 70s and the 80s, and win it then in the 90s. It is a very long-term process. And I'm maybe a pessimist here, but I don't think there is a quick win. You can perhaps be lucky and see something of an upsurge, as we have seen with the Yes Cymru. But how many of those will actually vote Plaid Cymru come next year's election? Again, maybe I'm a pessimist, but I don't think many of them will. I think there is definitely a crossover. I think a lot of those members of Yes Cymru may also be members of Plaid Cymru. But when you look at the heat maps that they've released of the members in some of the valleys, are they going to be voting Plaid Cymru next year? I think they'll be voting Labour. And why is that? Well, in those areas, more often than not, it's the Labour Party that has a presence on the ground. It is the Labour Party who's helping with the Christmas raffle or the Guy Fawkes nights or Meals on Wheels. It's that is the personable face of the political machine. And until you can compete on that level, you can hope for a star candidate like Leanne Wood, but they're going to be once a generation jobs. You're going to have to depend on a lot of luck there. If you want to make it happen, there's only one way of doing it, and that is to start from the ground up and admit it's going to take... I want to be not too pessimistic in case the party hears this. I think you need 10 years
right,
to be sure of being able to win a seat that you previously haven't held. At least 10 years. And people, I'm sure, will listen to this and be shouting at me saying, well, what about the SNP in Scotland? Blah, blah, blah. And I would go back and tell them that if you speak to a lot of SNP MPs who won their seats for the first time in 2015, they'll tell you that it came on the back of a lot of work they did back in the 90s. Consistently.
Right.
A lot of internal party reforms that the SNP did in the 90s, the early 90s, that they still credit with the lot of success that they have now, and it's then maintaining the good party machine. So yeah, so Plaid Cymru needs to, I should say that we are trying to get a presence on the ground in communities so that we're not these aliens from West Wales with, I don't know, 3 eyes, and we, again, as I said, we speak in rhyme and all this nonsense. That's the only way of really making people trust us, because we forget sometimes, and understandably so, given the number of elections we've had recently. Casting a vote is such an important act. It is such a valuable right, yes, but also, you imagine somebody who may have voted one way for decades, getting them to change their mind, giving them the confidence change their mind. It's going to take quite a bit of work and something special. So unless they are able to be in that ballot booth and think of, well, oh, I know so and so Plaid Cymru. Oh yeah, they helped me. They helped me. Oh, they helped my neighbour, and she said they were lovely. Right, okay. I do like their policies, and they're nice locally. Yeah, okay, I'll give them a shot. The number of people in Welsh election studies that say that they agree with Plaid Cymru or think that Plaid Cymru are nice. Christ, if we could win elections on that, we'd be in government for decades by now.
Right.
Well, not decades, but certainly the last few elections. And but that doesn't win you the election. There's an extra little bit. You've got to be credible, and you've got to be approachable as well in the same way. And that's the challenge we need to address. We do that, and it's not. The Labour Party could certainly counter that, of course. And I think you do see it in the electoral cycle. Happens all the time. You will see now the Labour Party, and again, this is not a criticism; it's an observation. It's quite shrewd politics, but they'll become far more small end nationalistic now ahead of the election, because they know that's the sweet spot in Welsh politics: is being very patriotic, proud to be Welsh. Stand up for Wales's corner. I think that was even a Labour Party slogan at one election as well. Standing up for Wales, or Wales's corner as well. Kind of centre left then as well. That's a sweet spot. And you as long as you kind of convey yourself in that image 6 months before the election, it's probably enough to hold on. So yeah, I've probably given the way now. I hope the Labour Party remember.
Next day, Ben Lake switches allegiance to the Labour Party. I like their slogans better. I mean, I think it makes great sense. I think ground game is, as they would say in America, right, is such a big part of politics, and it's just it is a numbers game ultimately. It is about people putting in that work, really contributing in those communities in a way that Plaid hasn't had a presence before. I think it's also fair to say that part of it is to do with the kinds of topics that are talked about, right? Because I think in politics you have manifestos and you have white papers and you have a huge ream of views on all kinds of politics. But for most people who vote, I think it's maybe one or two key issues that they identify a party as being tied to. And I think in somewhere like the valleys where there's, we know there's huge amounts of deprivation. We know there's huge problems with jobs, that people don't have opportunities they should have access to. Simple as that. That it's not a part of the country which is, as optimistic as the people there are, because the opportunities just aren't there. So I think having more of a laser focus on whether you want to call it jobs, whether you want to call it development, whether you want to call it just the real issues that affect people's day-to-day lives, would also serve Plaid Cymru very well. But you're right, you also need people to deliver that message in person, face-to-face. I think lots of people in the valleys, what's great about people in Wales in general, I would say actually, is very trusting, but often kind of not easily persuaded to support you. But once they are on side, they're really loyal and very trusting, and they give you that faith to do your best for them. So I think Plaid Cymru, I think it's an astute observation that they should work towards that. Thank you so much for your time, Ben. Incredibly insightful. And I think I'll reiterate what I said to you when I first met you, which is that I think the candor that you demonstrate as an elected official is really refreshing, and it allows for a very interesting conversation. And so I just want to say thank you so much for that, and keep doing what you're doing. We love it. We think it's great. And don't let kind of the political machine kind of turn you into another robot MP. It's really great to see.
Thank you, David, and thank you also for the opportunity to speak with you. Perhaps we can have a catch up again in a not too distant future to see if I have grown more cynical. The machine has grown me down.
Yeah, we'll play them side by side and see the comparison.
Yeah. Before and after.
Sounds great. All right, thank you, Ben. Cheers. Have a great day.
Thank you. Yeah.